Good morning. Great to connect with you in this way this morning. This morning we're looking at the question, can God exist if there is suffering, or why is there suffering in the world that we live in? The question of suffering is one we all face, whether we would call ourselves atheists, agnostics, theists like Christians, or whatever your worldview might be. And especially right now, we are wrestling with questions like this, and in particular this. Here are some common variations on this question of why is there suffering. I can't believe God exists because of all the greed and poverty in the world. I lost 2 close relatives to cancer, and therefore I can't believe God exists. How can God exist if he allows pandemics or tsunamis that kill so many people? And in there, in that little list of different versions of the same question, there are 2 categories of suffering. One is the evil that directly results in human suffering, so the evil that we do, and the other one is what could be referred to as natural suffering, including cancer, tsunamis, and disease. In a moment, we'll revisit these 2 categories and how they're treated in the Bible. But just let me list what we're going to try and do this morning. We're going to first of all look at some help for us if we are Christians, if we call ourselves Christians, how we are to respond to people that might ask us such questions at such times as these. And we're going to look at the whole thing of not trying to make this thing too simple, not being too simplistic. Secondly, we're going to look at the logical objection to God. And then thirdly, the emotional objection to God. But first of all, this is not simple, is my first point. We have to be honest and say, when people ask us big questions like, how can God exist, or why is there suffering, we have to, at some point, very early on, I would suggest, in our responses, we have to say we don't fully know, or we just don't know. I have to be honest and say I sympathise with people who are struggling in this area because I've struggled with this at times. And when they are suffering acute illness, when there's big when they're going through suffering that I have never experienced, I have to empathise and say I just don't necessarily know why this is happening to you, or why this is happening to a loved one, or why this is happening to thousands of people right now with the coronavirus, for example. This morning I'm not going to be able to also cover every topic, every element in this debate. Not in one morning, that would be impossible. And so you may be able to legitimately say after this that I haven't covered this or this particular aspect or that particular issue. And I just admit that's fine. We're not going to be able to do that this morning. And as with most things in life and church and the Bible, I just want to start here by saying, look, you can't be too simplistic. As Christians, we've got to be so careful in this first point. I just want to hammer home that we can't go looking for a quick fix or a one-size-fits-all answer. You can't do that with most of life. You can't do that with the Bible often, and you can't do that here with this whole subject. Ultimately, we don't know why God allows suffering, and we must start there with friends and family and people we meet that are asking us these questions. Some might say God allows suffering to teach us and to discipline us, to discipline those he loves, and that is even a verse that we can refer to. And this is exactly what I mean, and I'm going to give you a few of these examples in this first point of how we need to be careful. Some of the ways we often, as Christians, can simplify and oversimplify this huge question. We must be careful to avoid just saying one of these simplistic, boxed-in answers when they aren't giving the full kind of picture, they aren't helping us fully. And so some will say, for example, that God allows suffering to teach us and to discipline those he loves. And that can be true for some situations, and the Bible does talk about suffering producing perseverance. But it doesn't always answer every question. Some people with good character can suffer more than those who have, let's say, more questionable character. It doesn't necessarily go hand in hand according to how well behaved we are or how good we are. And then some will argue in another category or another box that they'll try and fit everything into. Some will argue that God doesn't allow suffering. It is people who cause suffering. And again, that's sometimes true, but not always true. And a lot of suffering takes place without any direct human involvement. And even if you want to go down the route of saying, look, humanity has let evil into the world, and therefore the world is broken, and therefore evil things happen and suffering happens, even if you want to go down that route, it doesn't fully explain on a logical or an emotional level why the baby of some beautiful saintly type person dies whilst the baby of a murderer might live, for example. It doesn't explain that on an emotional or logical level, even if we say, actually, do you know what, it's just a fallen, broken world that we're in. Another overly simplistic approach might be that we live in a world of physical laws, and that can be an answer, but again, it's not a box that fits all answers. Physical laws that mean things kind of react and happen and react to other events, and then things just occur because of the laws of physics. And but for example, the physical laws that mean if I stand on the tracks of the metro, of the trams in Manchester, I'm more likely to die from being hit by a tram. That might be true, but physical laws don't explain why some suffer more than others, why some people get cancer and others don't, why some die in car crashes or tornadoes or Ebola or COVID-19 and others don't. It doesn't fully explain it all. The Bible is full of suffering, and never does the Bible try to oversimplify it. If you look at the whole message of the Bible, it doesn't try and oversimplify. We must be careful we don't pick and choose boxes from the Bible that we try and fit all of our questions into. The Bible has suffering throughout its pages, and it attempts to come to terms with it, but it never gives a one-size-fits-all explanation. The book of Job is a beautiful example of that. It's all about one man's incredible suffering, and the main point is don't expect to be able to explain all of this away. Suffering can fit one of these categories that I've described, and can be easier to deal with certain types of suffering, like the evil acts done by one person. But like I said, it doesn't always work like that. And sometimes we have to admit we just don't know. And so the quick answer that we must get in when people are asking us about this sort of thing, the quick answer we must say at some point early on is we don't attempt to try and answer all of this. We don't attempt to be simplistic. We can just simply say we don't really fully know. I don't know why your sister got cancer at a young age. I don't know why that friend of yours died in their sleep unexpectedly. I don't know why that car crash took your friend. I'm so sorry. I don't know. But does that mean, bringing us on to our second point, does that mean that God cannot therefore exist? Let's go there now. The second point is the logical objection to the existence of God because of suffering. You might be thinking this question right now, and you're on a logical track, and there are people who have been on that track before you, people in history, people in more recent times, people like Stephen Fry, for example. He said if he met God, he would say to God, bone cancer in children? What's that all about? This is an old question. Ancient philosophers such as Epicurus have asked it, and asked it hundreds of years ago, in 300 BC, in fact a couple of millennia ago. This is an old question that ancient philosophers such as Epicurus have asked. In 300 BC, he said this: is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? We can ask the question in slightly different ways, but here is the basic problem in more detail. And hopefully this will come up on the screen or in the comments section. We can ask this question in slightly different ways, but the basic problem is this. Number one, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God would not allow suffering. Number two, suffering exists. Number three, therefore an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God does not exist. That's the kind of logic of these kind of arguments. It makes sense, it logically follows, and on the surface it all looks okay. But there is a problem. In fact, there's at least two problems. One I'll come back to in the emotional objection to God, but basically this is part of the problem. If God does not exist, number one, objective moral values do not exist, and so therefore nor does evil and nor does suffering. Number two, objective moral values and evil and suffering do exist, therefore God exists. We'll come back to that one, but also many philosophers struggle with this first set of statements because it assumes something that can't be assumed. It assumes that if God had a good reason to allow suffering, then I would know about it. So more accurately, we could revise a logical argument that I read out a moment ago like this. Number one, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God would not allow suffering without a good reason. Number two, I cannot think of such a good reason. Number three, therefore there isn't one. Number four, suffering exists. Therefore, number five, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God does not exist. Most societies in history have not gone this way. We've started to go here in the last 250 years or so. We started to think anything God would think or know about, we would know about and possibly understand. All major religions have emerged in societies where there was no pain relief, where more children were lost in childbirth, and yet it is our modern society that struggles the most with suffering in all of this. Why have these societies in history had less of a problem with suffering than us? Well, it's probably because this is how they've approached it. So that we've got another version of that logical argument that I gave you a moment ago. Number one, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God would not allow suffering without a good reason. Number two, I cannot think of such a good reason. Number three, my knowledge, however, is hugely limited. Number four, suffering exists. Number five, this is a mystery. And that's been okay for societies throughout history. The difference for us is we think we would know if there was a good reason for suffering. Let me illustrate it like this. It's a bit like if you were asked me to look out into a field and tell you if I could see a horse in the... let me say that again. It's like you asking me to look out on a field and tell you if there was a horse in that field. And I could probably tell you if there was a horse in that field or not if I looked. But if you asked me to tell you if there was a midgie, a small fly in the field, I wouldn't know if there was or not. Our assumption that any good reasons for suffering would be like horses and not small flies is the thing I'm pointing at here. Surely we would know. We see the good reasons for suffering as horses. We would see them, we would know them if they existed. And so at a logical level, this is how we could engage with the problem of suffering and evil in the world. It's just a couple of approaches to it. And in there is an assumption that I would know the reasons for suffering, even though I'm not all-knowing. But we are actually talking about, if we believe God exists and we believe the God of the Bible exists, then we're talking about an all-knowing God. So the assumption that I would know when I'm not all-knowing, I would know as much as an all-knowing God, doesn't stack up logically. There might be a reason that he has, I just can't see it because it's a fly, not a horse. Number 3, the emotional objection to God. And for most, the objection is not logical, but it is on this level of emotional, or it's a mixture of both. And so like Stephen Fry, there's an emotional response in there from him. How can God exist when children die of terrible diseases? And I understand that and sympathise with it. I have friends that have lost children to disease, to stillbirth. None of this is easy. I'm not pretending it is. This is not academic. This is not which brain is bigger and therefore wins the argument. This is way more painful, way more difficult than that, and so important that we talk about it, especially at this time. But much of the Bible is written by people who lament, who wail and cry out in the midst of suffering. And so no one can accuse the Bible of being out of touch. And I know, like I've said already, I know of people who have gone through some terrible loss and suffering. And some of those have then denounced God and his existence. And I know of others who have gone through similar, no less painful experiences and then pressed into God and gone far from denouncing him, actually clinging to him for dear life in the middle of those crises. And all I want to do is illustrate that there are 2 emotional responses to suffering. Number 1, there is no God. And number 2, that God is there and helping me through it, even though I might not understand. There is no God, and that there is a God, and he's helping me. And I want to make it clear that the second one, the second emotional response to suffering is possible and is valid. That the first option, the skeptical view that says there is no God, which many in our society, many in our country would share, and this is the problem I said we would come back to, that in this view there is, the problem that view's got is there's no such thing as objective evil. There's no such thing as good if you let that view play out to its logical conclusion. If you say, well, God can't exist because there's suffering on an emotional level, then if you let that play out, there is no suffering, then there is no evil. So if you let that play out that there is no God because there is suffering, then you are ending up in a place where there is no evil, there is only physical, there is no good or evil. We live, we die, there's no other person involved, there's no superior being involved. There's no, therefore, objective way of saying that something is either evil or good. We just get ill, we die young, or we die old, we are buried, and we take any evil that we have done or has been done to us into the ground. If suffering means that God does not exist, then a lot of other things can't exist either. Not in an objective way. There's no such thing as an objective view of evil. There's no such thing as an objective view of good. And any chance of justice and of righting of wrongs goes into the grave with us. Atheist Richard Dawkins says this: in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. He has taken it to that logical conclusion, and I think you have to say is the logical conclusion of there being no God because of suffering. He says this: nothing but blind, pitiless indifference in the universe. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. He's saying there is no evil, there is no good. We just dance to the music of DNA. A couple of years ago, 2013, so 7 years ago, England were playing Australia in cricket. And Stuart Broad had been caught, but the umpire did not see the bat make contact with the ball. So Stuart Broad held his ground and stayed out there, when actually the honourable cricket thing to do would have been to have admitted that he was out. Dawkins tweeted about this outrage that Stuart Broad cheated. The backlash on Twitter was swift. After all, Stuart Broad was just dancing to his DNA. You can't have objective morality or an objective good and evil without God. There is nowhere to measure from, but we all have a hunch there is something fundamentally wrong with what happened at 9/11. There's something fundamentally wrong with the Crusades. There's something fundamentally wrong with natural disasters and suffering and COVID-19. We think there is a bigger reason why these things are wrong. We don't just think this is DNA playing out. And the emotional response to suffering that ends by saying there is no God offers no hope, no emotional support, and when the experiences demand help. But there is nothing satisfying, nothing helpful, nothing to speak into the real world of emotion. There is no evil, there's only physical. There's no good, there's only physical. We live, we die. That's that first response. In the second view, that God is there and helping me through. Not there is suffering and therefore God can't possibly exist, but there is suffering so we can find evidence in our so there is suffering, and so we ask, can we find evidence in our universe of a God who might have an answer to that suffering? That's the second response on an emotional level. And if Jesus is real, if his story is true, if human evil is objectively real, if suffering is objectively real, if good is objectively real, then can it be true that Jesus enters into that very real evil and real suffering, and actually that real evil is defeated and death is defeated and real love wins, and that the world one day will be made right? The contrast between the two emotional responses to suffering is remarkable. Couldn't be more different. One of these two options has immense power to emotionally uphold people who suffer. The other one is totally powerless and empty and hopeless. Literally hopeless. Even though I can look at suffering and say, I still don't know, I can look at suffering and say, it's not that God doesn't love us. And in the Christian Bible, I can see his love in the cross. Jesus entered into this suffering world and suffered himself. He's not distant from us, but totally loving, totally involved, and cares so much that he suffered the most cruel death imaginable. Then he rose again to defeat death and its power, and to one day make all things new. Looking at Jesus means I can say, I don't know why my mum's twin died at birth. I don't know why close friends of ours growing up lost their daughter at the age of 9. I don't know why a school friend of mine died in a car crash. I don't know why my cousin's baby was stillborn. I don't know why, but looking at Jesus, I know it's not because he doesn't love us. He proved he loves us on the cross. It doesn't answer every question you have, your friends will have and still have. And if you would like to talk further, then please write on the comments and ask to speak to somebody. We'd love to connect with you in that way. I know these things don't answer every question, but I also know that in Jesus there's hope and comfort and some sense of an answer. But thank you for listening, thank you for connecting. I hope this has helped you. If you wouldn't say you're a follower of Jesus, and if you are a follower of Jesus, I hope this has helped you as well. Maybe just answer some of your own questions, but also to help others, especially at this time. And so, God bless you today, and thank you again.